extreme in the first term. Well, you know, the second term was somewhat different. For one thing, some of the most extreme figures were kicked out. Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, and a couple of others were sent off to pasture. They couldn't get rid of Cheney because he was the administration, so can't dismantle it. But a lot of the others went, and the policy shifted more towards the norm, to the more or less centrist norm. And you know, little talk about negotiations, I mean, less aggression and so on, and a more polite attitude toward allies. So that it was more acceptable, and fundamentally didn't change, but it was more acceptable. And this prediction was that that's what Obama would do. And I think that's pretty much what happened. In fact, there's a pretty interesting characterization of this, which sort of captures it, I think, pretty well. It's anachronistic, but I think it applies. Back in 1962, at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the world really was coming, you know, dangerously close to a nuclear war, which would have been sort of the end. Most dangerous moment in history, Arthur Schlesinger called it, Kennedy's advisor. Right at the peak of the missile crisis, U.S. planners were considering measures which they knew might destroy Europe, and in fact, in particular, Britain. So they were kind of playing out these scenarios which led to the destruction of Britain, but and taking them very seriously. In fact, taking the steps towards them. But they didn't let Britain know. Britain is supposed to have a special relationship with the United States, but the British were pretty upset. They couldn't find out what was going on. The Prime Minister, Macmillan, all they could find out was what British intelligence was picking up. So here they're the best and the brightest. They're making plans that might well lead to the destruction of Britain, but they're not telling them. At that point, a senior advisor, I think it was probably Dean Acheson of the Kennedy administration, entered the discussion, and he defined the special relationship. He said the special relationship with Britain means that Britain is our lieutenant. The fashionable word is partner. And the British, of course, like to hear the fashionable word. Well, that's pretty much the difference between Bush and Obama. Bush simply told him, you're our lieutenant. You do what we say or you're irrelevant. In fact, that's the word that I think Colin Powell used at the UN. Do what we say or you're irrelevant. You're just our lieutenant and forget about it. But they don't like to hear that. What they like to hear is that you're our partner. You know, we love you. And then back in secret, we treat you as our lieutenant, but that's okay. And I suspect that that's the main difference.
What about the anti-war movement in the United States? You've long been a participant in it, very active in Vietnam right up until today. But where do you see it in relation to the person that many of them devoted tremendous efforts to elect?
Well, you know, actually, my view, which is not the standard one, is that the anti-war movement is far stronger now than it was in the 60s. In the 1960s, there was a point, you know, 1968, 69, when there was a very strong anti-war movement against the war in Vietnam. But it's worth remembering that the war in Vietnam started, an outright war started in 1962. And by then, maybe 70 or 80,000 people had already been killed under the U.S. client regime. But in 1962, Kennedy really opened an outright war, you know, sent the American Air Force to start bombing South Vietnam under South Vietnamese markings, but everybody knew. It was even reported. Authorized napalm, authorized chemical warfare to destroy crops and ground cover, started the programs which drove ultimately millions of people from the countryside into what amounted to concentration camps to try to, the words were, to protect them from the guerrillas who the government knew perfectly well they were supporting. same kind of things you read now in Afghanistan if you bother to read the fine print about the conquest of Marja. But we had to drive them into concentration camps to protect them from the guerrillas they were supporting. That's a war. You know, it's a serious war. Protest was zero, literally. I mean, it was years before you could get any sign of protest. I mean, those of you who are old enough may remember that in Boston, liberal city, in October 1965, that's 3 years after that, hundreds of thousands of American troops rampaging the country, you know, war spread to North Vietnam and so on. We tried to have our first public demonstration against the war on the Boston Common, usual demonstration place. It's October 1965. I was supposed to be one of the speakers. He couldn't say a word. It was broken up, you know, violently. A lot of students marched over trying to break it up. Hundreds of state police there. The next day, the Boston Globe, most liberal paper in the country, you know, devoted its whole front page to denouncing the demonstrators, not the ones who were breaking it up. You know, a picture of a wounded soldier in the middle, that sort of thing. Well, that was October 1965, you know. Hundreds of thousands of troops there, war escalating beyond. Well, finally, after years, in 1968, you got a substantial anti-war movement, 67, 68. By then, South Vietnam was gone. It was virtually destroyed. And the same was true of much of the rest of Indochina. Well, the war did go on for a long time with horrible effects, and we were unwilling to face the fact, even to report the fact. But nevertheless, the anti-war movement did have an effect very late. Or compare Iraq. There were huge protests before the war was officially launched. I mean, we now know that Blair and Bush were simply lying when they said that they were trying to work for a diplomatic settlement. They'd already started the war. Okay, that came out in the famous Downing Street memos in England. But it hadn't been officially announced. But there were huge demonstrations. And I think they had an effect. The U.S. war in Iraq was horrible enough. You know, probably killed about 1 million people, drove a couple of million out of the country, devastated the country, you know, destroyed it. Horrible cultural destruction and so on. It was pretty awful. Could have been a lot worse. It's not what the U.S. did in South Vietnam. Nothing like it. You know, no saturation bombing with B-52s, chemical warfare, and so on. And I think it was retarded by the anti-war movement. The population here had just become more civilized. That's one of those grim effects of the 1960s.
And Afghanistan?
Pardon?
And Afghanistan?
Afghanistan is an interesting case. Afghanistan was sold here as a war to retaliate, to adjust, it's always called a just war, to prevent terror, you know, retaliate against a terrorist attack. It's such a standard view that to take it apart, you know, requires more time than I'd be allowed. But the fact of the matter is that that was not the goal of the war. I mean, if the goal of the war was to isolate al-Qaeda, eliminate terror, there were straightforward ways to proceed. I mean, if you go back to that time, the jihadi movement itself was highly critical of the 9/11 attack. There were fatwas coming out from the most radical clerics in, you know, Al-Azhar University, the main theological center, denouncing al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, and the terrorist attacks on Islamic. We don't want to do that, and so on. Well, if you wanted to end terror, the obvious thing to do at that point is to isolate al-Qaeda, to try to gain support, even from the jihadi movement, and of course from the population they're trying to mobilize. You know, terrorists regard themselves as a vanguard. They're trying to mobilize others to their cause. I mean, every specialist on terrorism knows that. So you could have done it then, and you could have proceeded to identify the perpetrators, which incidentally they couldn't do because they didn't know who they were, and that was conceded later. But you could have tried to identify them, bring them to justice, you know, to trials, with fair trials, not torture, but fair trials, which would have probably sharply reduced, if maybe not, maybe even have ended Islamic terrorism. Well, they did the opposite. What they tried to do is to mobilize the population and mobilize the jihadi movement to support al-Qaeda. That's exactly the effect of first invading Afghanistan and later invading Iraq. And it's also the effect of Guantanamo and Bagram and the other torture centers. I mean, everyone who's involved in them, serious knows, yeah, they created terrorists.
Do you think Obama should have these Guantanamo prisoners tried in New York?
Well, it depends whether we want to regard ourselves as a civilized country, as a rogue state. If you want to be a rogue state, do whatever you like, kill them, torture them, whatever. If you want to be part of the civilized world, and also if you want to reduce the appeal of the extreme jihadi movement, then try them in civilian courts. In fact, the very fact that they're in Guantanamo is outlandish. First of all, what's Guantanamo? I mean, Guantanamo was taken from Cuba a century ago at gunpoint. They said, give us Guantanamo or else. Cuba was under military occupation. It's called a treaty, but, okay. But, and the Treaty of Guantanamo, if you want to call it that, allowed Guantanamo to be used as a coaling station for the Navy. Well, it's not what it's being used for. In fact, as you know perfectly well, it was used for Haitian refugees. When Haitians were fleeing from the dictatorships that the U.S. was supporting, the U.S. refused to permit them political asylum. It claimed that they were just economic refugees. And the Coast Guard tried to stop them, and if any got through, they sent them to Guantanamo. Okay, and now you know what they're being used for. Actually, what they are being used for is to create terrorists. It's not my opinion. That's the opinion of the main U.S. interrogators, people like Matthew Alexander, who actually has an article on it in the same issue of national interest that I mentioned. So yeah, it's a great way to create terrorists. It inspires terrorism all over, and it turns many of these people there into terrorists, even if they were picked up for whatever reason it was. So yes, if you want to, if your goal is to reduce the threat of, say, Islamic terrorism, and to become part of the civilized world, you have civilian trials. Just as those who are in Guantanamo, first of all, most of those who are in Guantanamo, I mean, it's kind of outrageous anyways. Like some 15-year-old kid who was found holding a rifle when the U.S. is invading his country. That's a terrorist, Okay, but that's a large part of maybe almost all of what's in Guantanamo. But if you want it, but what should have been done with them, if the goal was to be civilized and to reduce terrorism, is to put them in prison in the United States. Well, there's no security problem. They're not going to get out of a maximum security prison. And they don't have some magic way of spreading poison around the world or anything. But of course, the government didn't want to do that because it had no evidence. And if they were sent to Guantanamo so that they could, it was hoped, be free from U.S. Jurisdiction. So you could you could pretend that they weren't under U.S. jurisdiction, so the laws didn't apply. Well, the Supreme Court finally, after a long time, kind of whittled away at that and said, yes, they have the right of habeas corpus. The Bush administration accepted that. Obama doesn't. The Obama administration is trying to overturn a decision by a right-wing Bush judicial appointee that the Supreme Court decision holds for Bagram, the torture center in Afghanistan. And the Obama administration is trying to override that, so that means that the Supreme Court decision is just a joke. If you want to torture somebody, don't send them to Guantanamo because the Supreme Court said you can't torture them there. Send them to Bagram. So if you pick somebody up in Yemen or wherever you pick them up, and you want them not to be subject to international law, also U.S. law, okay, send them to Bagram. That's the Obama administration position. I mean, it's for reasons like these that even the most hawkish terrorism specialists, people like Michael Scheuer, who was in charge for the CIA of following Obama for years, he says that Al-Qaeda's, Osama bin Laden's best ally is the United States. We're doing exactly what he wants. What he wants is trying to sell a line to the Muslim world. These guys are on a crusade. They're trying to kill us. We've got to defend ourselves. And the U.S. is acting, as if they're under command. We do everything he wants.
What do you think Obama should do about Israel-Palestine? What do you think people here should do?
I mean, Israel-Palestine happens to be a particularly easy case. I mean, there has been an overwhelming international consensus for 35 years on how to settle the problem, short-term at least, namely a two-state settlement on the international border, which everyone agrees on, with, the phrase was, minor and mutual modifications. That was U.S. official policy until the U.S. departed from the world in the early 70s, as it did. That's just overwhelming. I mean, there was a Security Council resolution in 1976 calling for a two-state settlement. The U.S. vetoed it. And it just goes on from there. I won't run through it. But if you get till today, there's just overwhelming agreement. I mean, it includes all the Arab states for a long time. It includes Iran, the Organization of Islamic States. It includes Hamas, In fact, everybody except the United States and Israel. So what has Obama had to say about this? Well, it's interesting. He has this great vision. But if you go below the vision and take a look at the words, it's a little different. So his only word so far, there are two really. One is to politely ask Israel to stop expanding settlements. Well, first of all, that's meaningless. The issue is the existence, not the expansion of the settlements. But furthermore, those words were also meaningless. He was quoting Bush. In fact, he was quoting what's called the roadmap, the official, supposedly the agreed upon scenario for moving forward. He was quoting it. Okay, that's meaningless, but that's part of his great vision. The other part, which is more interesting, was a few days after he took office. And he gave his one and so far only a serious talk about Israel-Palestine. That's when he was introducing George Mitchell as his negotiator, which is a good choice if he's given any leeway. And Obama explained what he was going to do. He said, this was his, being very forthcoming to the Arab world. He said, well, there's a constructive proposal on the table, the Arab peace proposal, pat people on the head for producing it. And then he went on to say, well, it's time for the Arabs to live up to their peace proposal. They should start normalizing relations with Israel. Well, Obama's literate, intelligent. I suppose he chooses his words carefully. He knows perfectly well that that was not the Arab peace proposal. The Arab peace proposal re-endorsed the long-standing international consensus and said, in the context of a two-state settlement, the Arab states will proceed even beyond to normalize relations with Israel. Well, Obama picked out the corollary, but omitted the substance, which is a way of saying we're going to maintain our rejectionist stance. Couldn't have been clearer. And that's what's happened. With regard to his repetition of the call to stop expansion of settlements, he did go a little bit farther. Not he, but his spokespersons in press conferences. They were asked, is the administration going to do anything about it, and if Israel rejects it? And they said no, it's purely symbolic. In fact, explicitly said that the administration is not going to do what George Bush I did. George Bush I had some light taps on the wrist if Israel continued to reject what the U.S. was asking for. Clinton pretty much withdrew that, and Obama withdrew it totally. He said, no, this is just symbolic. Well, that's telling Benjamin Netanyahu, go ahead and do what you like. We'll say we don't like it, but there'll be a wink saying, yeah, go ahead. Meanwhile, we participate in it. We send you the arms, we give you the diplomatic support, direct participation. That's the vision, It could hardly be clearer. Now, what can we do about it? well, we can get the United States to join the world. In this case, it's literally the whole world. Just join the world and accept the international consensus and stop the direct participation in violating it. I mean, what Israel is doing, and what the U.S. and Israel are doing, everything Israel does is a joint operation. They can't go beyond what the U.S. permits and participates in. So what the U.S. and Israel are doing in Gaza and in the West Bank is destroying the hope for realization of the international consensus. And there's no alternative around, I should say, with regard to a lot of the pro-Palestinian supporters of the Palestinians. In fact, some of the leading Palestinian activists themselves are saying, well, we ought to give up on the two-state solution and just let Israel take over all the territories, maybe annex them, and then there'll be a civil rights struggle, and like an anti-apartheid struggle, and that can work, like South Africa. That's just blindness. That's not going to happen. The U.S. and Israel are not going to permit that to happen. They're going to continue with exactly what they're doing, strangling Gaza, separating it from the West Bank in violation of international agreements, and in the West Bank, take over whatever they want. So take over the Arab land, the nice suburbs of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, which happen to be in the West Bank, take over the Jordan Valley, Arab land again, take over the water resources, and build salients running through the rest of the territory that break it up into cantons, what Ariel Sharon, the author of the policies, the main author, was honest enough to call Bantustans. Well, let's break it up into that. It doesn't take any responsibility for the Palestinians, and no demographic problem, no Arabs in a Jewish state, no anti-apartheid struggle, no civil rights struggle. And that's not hypothetical, that's just what we're doing. So yeah, we'll continue to do that. That's the alternative to a two-state settlement. And it's within reach, greater things than that have happened easily, but it's going to take a lot of pressure.
We're going to take some questions from the audience. You can see the microphone set up, and as people go for that microphone, one last question. As you look out on folks here, many young people, many students, I was wondering if you could reflect on your career at the moments when you had to make a decision about whether to take a risk that might risk your position or your standing in some way. When you felt what you say to people when it comes to issues of courage?
Well, I don't like to talk about myself, and it's not important, but since you asked a couple of times. The first time, I had been a political activist all my life, since childhood. You talked about my newsstand and so on. But with regard to, say, really doing something, say, becoming involved with the non-existent anti-war movement, the first time was around 1962. You could see what was happening in 1962. It wasn't really concealed. And I decided to try to get involved in organizing anti-war activism. Now, it wasn't risky, but it meant giving up a lot. You cannot put, I don't have to tell you, you can't put one toe in this. If you get into it, it's a full-time occupation.
Were you a tenured professor at the time? In 1956, you went to MIT, you were teaching.
1955, I forget what year it was, but it wasn't a consideration. In fact, it may be odd for you to think about, but MIT in the 1960s had two interesting characteristics. One was almost entirely funded by the Pentagon. In fact, I was in a lab which was 100% funded by the three armed services. Two, it was the main center of anti-war resistance. I'm not talking about dissent or protest. I'm talking about resistance. Organizing resistance activities, illegal activities. And the Pentagon didn't care much because contrary to what a lot of people believe, one of the main functions of the Pentagon is just to provide a cover for the way the economy functions. The way the economy functions is, people like to claim it's a free market economy, but most of it comes out of the state sector. I mean, computers, internet, airplanes. The idea is the public is supposed to pay the costs and take the risks, and if anything works out, you hand it over to private enterprise. That's called the free market. And the way when the economy was mainly electronics-based, the Pentagon was the cover. So, you got to do this because the Russians are coming. But they actually didn't really care what you were doing. I mean, it's an interesting story. Anyhow, so yeah, maybe I was tenured, maybe not, but it didn't matter. I got involved in 1962, and what that meant, so like if I'd give a talk in a church, which I sometimes did, it would mean 4 people, the minister, the organizer, a drunk who walked in off the street, and a guy who wanted to kill me. That was a talk in a church. And that went on for a couple of years. The only really risky step. Are
you suggesting the anti-war movement during Vietnam was mainly alcoholic?
Right. Don't tell David Brooks. In 1965, I tried to organize, an artist friend of mine, since died, tried to organize national tax resistance. Well, we got somewhere, so that's taking sort of a mild risk. But in 1966, there were the stirrings of an effort to organize more serious resistance.
Did you not pay your taxes?
I didn't pay my taxes for years. But how the IRS reacted is kind of interesting. In my case, of course they can get the money.
And did they just take it out of your salary?
Took it. I got a nasty letter from them from some computer. But in some cases, they randomly, as far as I could tell, they took people's houses. People went to jail and so on. So there's a kind of a risk associated with it. But more serious was support of direct resistance, support for resistors, deserters, and so on and so forth. And that began around 1966. It became public in 1967. And that did carry potential penalties. I mean, actually, my wife, we had 3 kids. She went back to college after 17 years because we expected I'd probably end up in jail. And it came pretty close. I mean, a trial was announced in '68, which I was the main defendant. I was saved, as were others, by the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive came along in January 1968, and it convinced the business world in the United States that the U.S. that this was just becoming too costly.
What were you charged with?
The charges were conspiracy to, resist the draft or overthrow the government or something or other. The conspiracy trials are kind of an interesting story. I could talk about them, but it was real. If it hadn't been for the Tet Offensive, I probably would have spent a couple of years in jail. But
did you go through the trial?
The trials were called off right after the Tet Offensive. There was one that was underway, but the Spock trial, where they picked all the wrong people, and that it was overturned on appeal, but mainly because of the Tet Offensive. I mean, the business world just said, look, out. In fact, what happened in 1968 is that a group of so-called wise men, big shots from Wall Street and so on, went down to Washington and basically gave the president marching orders. It was a very real power play. Johnson was told, stop the bombing of North Vietnam, don't run for office again, and begin negotiations and start to withdraw. And he followed orders to the letter. Then Nixon came along and did it a different way. But the visible escalation of the war declined. Visible, I say, because some of the worst atrocities were in 1969, and then it went off to Cambodia and Laos, where it was even worse. But that was kind of invisible, it still is. But it kind of tempered at that point. And one of the things that was done was to call off the trials, because there was an effort on the part of the government to sort of make peace, make peace with the students. And that was an interesting story, too. But that ended the trials. But, yeah, that was risky. Civil disobedience it's no fun. I mean, you can't really say it's risky, so maybe you get maced or beaten or something like that. Spent a couple of days in jail, but not the pleasantest experience. But it's not the kind of risk that dissidents take in other countries, you know. But that's the kind of decisions you have to make. You just can't become involved part-time in these things. It's either serious and you're seriously involved, or you know, you go to a demonstration and go home and forget about it and go back to work. You know. Nothing happens. You know. I mean, things only happen by really dedicated, diligent work. I mean, we're not allowed to say nice things about the Communist Party, right? That's like a rule. But one of the reasons why the New Deal legislation worked, you know, which was significant, you know, just changed the country, was because there were people who were there every day, whether it was a civil rights issue, a labor rights issue, organizing, anything else. They were there, ready to turn the mimeograph machines, no internet, organized demonstrations. They had a memory, you know, the movement had a memory, which it doesn't have now. Now everyone starts over from fresh. But it had a kind of a tradition, a memory that people were always there. If you look back, it was very heavily Communist Party activists. Well, you know, that was destroyed. And it's one of the lack of such a sector of dedicated, committed people who understand that you're not going to win tomorrow. You know, you're going to have a lot of defeats, and there'll be a lot of trouble, you know, and a lot of things will happen to you that aren't nice. But if you keep at it, you can get somewhere. And that's why we have had a civil rights movement and labor movement and so on.
Someone have the microphone?
Thank you very much, Professor Chomsky. I had the pleasure to listen to you when I was a graduate student many years ago, and I happened to be in town. I'm glad to listen to you here today. Some years back, before he died, Bob McNamara wrote a book, The Fog of War. Actually, it's a movie, and he also drew some lessons from the war. What is your assessment of the lessons of Vietnam? How effectively do you think we as a nation are applying them today, and what would you change based on that experience?
I'll tell you what I think and what I wrote back in 1970, which I still think, but I have to tell you I'm like a minority of one, so it's no consensus opinion. The left doesn't like it, the right doesn't like it, nobody likes it. The only people who liked it, what I was saying then, was the business world, because I was basically repeating what they were saying. What they were saying around 1970, part of the reason for telling Johnson, you know, call it off, is they recognized that the U.S. had already won the war. I mean, the left doesn't like to hear that, because they like to hear, you know, people united can never be defeated and so on and so forth. Makes you feel good. Actually, the peace movement, the anti-war movement had an effect. I mean, it saved the society from total destruction, which probably would have happened. So it did have an effect. But the U.S. achieved its major war aims and had done so by around 1970. If you look back at the planning, we have a detailed record of internal planning from the Pentagon Papers and later releases. The goal of the war was not to conquer Vietnam. Vietnam's of no particular interest to the United States. It could, you know, fly off the face of the earth, and the U.S. wouldn't have cared. Eisenhower tried to build up some support for the war by talking about the tin and the rubber and so on, but that was so marginal it didn't matter. What they were afraid of is what a very consistent feature of policy, right through U.S. policy, but, you know, imperial policy generally. It's a policy that, for the public, is called the domino theory. And then when it doesn't work, you kind of laugh about it. But it's a real principle, so it never changes. And what you ought to call it is the mafia principle. International affairs is run like the mafia, very much like it. And the Godfather does not accept disobedience. It's too dangerous. You know, even if it's some small storekeeper somewhere who isn't paying protection money, you can't accept that. I mean, if he doesn't pay protection money and gets away with it, you know, the next guy will start, and pretty soon the whole system control erodes. So what you do is you send in your goons, not just to get the money, which you don't care about, but to beat them to a pulp. so everyone else gets the idea. You don't disobey orders. That's the way international affairs runs, pretty much. Cuba is a case in point. Iran today is a case in point. And Vietnam was very clearly a case in point. The U.S. was concerned that Vietnam might move towards successful independent development, which could be what planners called a virus that would spread contagion. We don't care about Vietnam, but if the contagion spreads to Thailand and especially to Indonesia, which really had rich resources, that would be dangerous. Then the system of control starts to fall apart. And what they were really concerned about was what John Dower, a leading Asia historian, called the super domino. Super domino was Japan. If Indonesia and the rest of Southeast Asia began to move towards independent development, Japan would accommodate, was the word that was used. Japan would accommodate to an independent, developing South and Southeast Asia, and would become its technological center and its commercial center and so on. That would mean that the United States had lost the Second World War. It's not a small thing. The Second World War in the Pacific was fought in large measure to prevent Japan from establishing what it called a new order, approximately what I just described. Well, the United States in 1950 wasn't ready to lose the Second World War. And that was the main reason for supporting the French reconquest of the colony. And by the late 60s, it was evident that Vietnam is never going to be a model for anyone. It'll be lucky if it survives. And by 1965, the contagion had been stopped. You got a virus that's spreading contagion. What you do is destroy the virus and inoculate the targets. Well, that was done. You take a look at what's happening in the 60s. Brutal dictatorships were instituted in all the surrounding countries. Okay, that inoculates them. No virus. The virus was destroyed by the late 60s. In 1965, the most important country, Indonesia, there was a coup. Suharto coup killed maybe 1 million people, mostly landless peasants, destroyed the only mass political party. It was greeted with total euphoria in the United States, England, and Australia. I mean, they just couldn't contain themselves. A gleam of light in Asia, the New York Times, and so on. I mean, they knew it was happening. Staggering mass slaughter, a gleam of light in Asia, nothing secret. But it was recognized that, and they opened themselves up to Western exploitation, so it was all wonderful. In retrospect, McGeorge Bundy, who was the National Security Advisor for Kennedy and Johnson, in retrospect, he said he thought we really should have called off the war in Vietnam in 1965 because the main outcome, it had already basically been won after the Indonesian coup, and going on was just too costly for ourselves, so it was a dumb thing to do. Anyway, that was my feeling then, and it's pretty much my feeling now. The lesson that we ought to learn, there was a split in American public opinion, very sharp split, very visible in the early 70s between elite opinion, newspapers, Harvard faculty, and so on the one hand, and the general population on the other, not the anti-war movement, the general population. In elite opinion, articulate opinion, and that you can read, so it's easy to document, the most extreme condemnation of the war was that it was a mistake which proved to be too costly. Okay, that's about as far as you can go. Among the public, about 70% in polls said it's not a mistake, it's fundamentally wrong and immoral. Okay? It's a very sharp and significant split, and I think the lesson we'll learn is, to bring it to today, that, say, when Obama is praised for opposing the war in Iraq because he thought it was a mistake, we should recognize that to be on a par with Nazi generals after Stalingrad, who thought that the two-front war was a mistake. The issue isn't whether it's a mistake, it's whether it's fundamentally wrong and immoral. Well, that's the lesson that has to be drawn. That's what the public probably already understands, but we have to do something with and organize with.
I'll just say one thing. There's this quote that I've been trying to find out who said it. I think back on my life over all the times I thought I went too far, and I realize now I didn't go far enough. I don't think Noam Chomsky said that.
Yeah, that's a good quote.
I think we will have to stop here. Professor Chomsky has other engagement, but I would really like to thank Professor Chomsky and Ms. Amy Goodman for joining us today.